Thanks for tuning into this presentation, Endangered Species Federal Policy, a Year in Review, 2025 to 2026. I am Jewel Tomasula, the National Policy Director at Endangered Species Coalition. So for this presentation, we're going to go over just the top federal policy developments of 2025 and up to this point of 2026. The time of this recording is May 8th. And it's been a year characterized by a lot of rapid development, some extreme proposals, and a lot of surprises, actually. So wanted to make note of the time because it's very possible that things could change over the next week or um, whenever you might be tuning into this. So that's an important note to make. Also, when we talk about federal policy, I like to start off with the framing here and how we think about federal policy. There's two buckets. One is the Trump administration. It's changes to how federal agencies are operating on the day-to-day, their policies, their guidelines, and so really at that federal agency level. It's also proposed changes to implementation of the Endangered Species Act. So with an administration policy proposal or administration decision, that's how we think about this. It's and it can change with administrations. Now, the second bucket is U.S. Congress. So when we're talking about this, it's changes to funding levels and directives for the federal agencies, and then proposed changes to the Endangered Species Act law itself. So wanted to make that distinction because with administration, it's all about implementation and those operations, and it can change back or change in a different way, depending on who's in the White House. But with Congress, it's about changing the law itself. And there's a higher threshold for changing because it has to go through the chambers, be signed by the president and such. But it's also a much more permanent change and harder to change it later because it has to go through that same high bar process again. All right, so what are we going to talk about in this presentation? What did we see over this past year? Just wanted to cover the most broad-reaching proposals or decisions in this presentation, but I'll recognize that there was a lot. There's a lot that happened in this past year for certain species, certain habitats that just there. It was quite the year. But touching on here some of the most broad-reaching. So in the Trump administration category, I'm going to touch on the Endangered Species Act harm rule, the Endangered Species Act rules, and then an ESA exemption for Gulf oil and gas activities, also known as the God Squad. And then for U.S. Congress, I'll talk about appropriations, and then the ESA Amendments Act. But as we get into that, just the refresher, the Endangered Species Act, our foundational environmental laws, bedrock conservation framework. It was signed into U.S. law in 1973. And so it's been over 50 years of work under this framework for protecting our species and working towards the recovery. And it's been quite the success. 99% of species ever protected under the Endangered Species Act are still with us today. So in terms of that job of preventing species from being lost forever, preventing extinction, it's knocking it out of the park. And then another statistic that I'd like to call attention to is that it's an extremely popular law. 84% of Americans support the Endangered Species Act, and this has been consistent over decades of polling, and this polling is as recent as 2025. where we're still seeing that 84% of Americans support the ESA. They've also looked into how that shakes out in terms of like people in cities, people in rural environments, and different ideologies, and that it's pretty consistent, and there's no real divide. It is something that unites us, is this understanding that we should prevent extinction. So let's get into the Trump administration proposals that we saw over the past year. So the first one is what's called the ESA harm rule. And just up front, this is under review. It is not a final proposal. It's not how operations are happening. It's still under review. That could change very soon, though, or we could see that change to a final rule soon. But right now, under review. So in April 2025, the Trump administration proposed a new rule that would redefine harm to exclude harm to habitat. And the goal of this proposal is to allow timber, oil, mining, and other extractive industries, as well as the federal government, especially in how they permit these industries and individuals as well, to destroy habitat where species protected by the Endangered Species Act to live, even if the damage to habitat harms those species. So this proposal caused a lot of alarm. Scientists spoke out, people who work on recovery of species spoke out, and there was a huge attention to this public comment period, and over 100,000 comments were submitted, and many of those expressing that concern to this proposal. The next big development was this ESA rules, sometimes also called the ESA regulations. And again, the status here is still under review. These have not been finalized. But in November 2025, the administration proposed rules that would hollow out the Endangered Species Act. These rules would slow or deny protections for species already in crisis, limit the role of science in decisions to protect species, and make it easier to ignore species' critical habitat to clear the way for drilling, mining, pipelines, and other destructive operations. So I'll note a bit of history here is that under the first Trump administration, back in that 2018, 2019 time period, nearly identical versions of these rules were proposed, and then they were finalized, and they were challenged in court. And much of them were stopped through that court process. These are pretty nuanced rules. It could be a whole presentation or seminar just to go through the details of these rules. But the bottom line here is that they were proposed before. Much of them were found to be illegal, of misinterpretation of the Endangered Species Act law itself. So the administration now should be taking that into account as they're trying to put forth these rules again, but that can't be held to account. Like, they can't be held accountable to that until we see the final rule. And so that court process will start over again if the Trump administration were to finalize these rules again. So just a note about how there's some track record here of these rules not being compliant with the letter of the law of the Endangered Species Act itself. But the way these administration processes go, it will be finalized. There will have to be a start of that process again. And then I'll note here that it was a short public comment period. It was November 2025 in that it opened up, and then within it was a 30-day public comment period that closed up in December 2025. And even with that short public comment period, we had nearly 400,000 people, from folks who just care about wildlife to scientists to people who work on the ground recovering species to people with legal expertise, like people of all sorts, um, putting in their public comment. And we had nearly 400,000 in opposition. And so there was a strong pushback to this. Members of Congress also put in their opposition. Leaders of state wildlife agencies and people, voices from the states put it in opposition. So that is there on the public record, the strong pushback and concern, which, but it right now it's under review, and we're waiting to see what happens there. And the last under the Trump administration decisions, proposals that I want to talk about, those PAC 2 were proposals. This one here is actually a decision that was made. This is an exemption for oil and gas industry activities in the Gulf. And so this is a decision that was made on March 31st, 2026 from a panel of federal government officials led by Doug Burgum, who's the Secretary of Interior, and Pete Hegseth, who's the Secretary of Defense. And this panel is officially named the Endangered Species Committee, and it's often called the God Squad in the news. So if you want to look up more, you could do a search for Endangered Species Act, God Squad, Gulf, and learn more that way. We are saying that it's better understood as an extinction committee because they're making this decision to entirely waive Endangered Species Act protections, and it's an active choice to doom species to extinction. And so a bit of background here is that this Endangered Species Committee is in the Endangered Species Act law itself, this provision that allows the Secretary of Interior to bring together these committee members to weigh whether a certain activity is so critical for human well-being that it has to go forward, even if it means extinction. But in the Endangered Species Act law, it is a very careful process. There's supposed to be deliberation, scientists involved, experts involved, community members involved. It's supposed to be a very deliberate, it's a consequential decision. We're talking about extinction. That's not what happened on March 31st. Secretary Burgum and then Secretary Hegseth pulled together these federal officials. They spent about 15 minutes. There was a 15-minute meeting, spent about just short amount of time just saying yeah, we're going to waive any Endangered Species Act obligations for the entire oil and gas industry in the Gulf. And it's also unprecedented what a sweeping exemption this is. It's for this entire industry, their operations for the next several decades in the Gulf, and just no Endangered Species Act accountability or duties expected from all industry operations at all. So that's not just the drilling, it's everything around oil and gas with the ocean noise that's created from the seismic technologies for exploration. That's how fast the vessels are going. And these activities all cause a risk for wildlife in the Gulf, the whales, the sea turtles. And if there's an oil spill, that is super damaging impact as well. But it's just entirely waived. This is the severity of this cannot be understated, and brings me here where unprecedented is too mild a term. It's beyond belief. If upheld, this decision would mark the first time a US president consciously allows a whale species to go extinct. It will happen before our very eyes. What a black mark on our legacy that would be. That's a quote from Professor Pat Parento. He's an ESA expert. He was part of the drafting process for that Endangered Species Committee provision back in the late 1970s, and has quite a bit of history with the past iterations of that Endangered Species Committee. So this is a quote for him that I find to capture this very well. And that whale that he's talking about is the Rice's whale. There's only 51 of them in the Gulf now, and the Gulf is the only place in the world where they live. So just noting that this is a recent decision. Right now, there's no Endangered Species Act obligations for this entire industry and their operations in the Gulf. And there was quite a bit of pushback to this. There are court challenges to it going through, and public opposition is growing. And this is something Endangered Species Coalition is prioritizing, drawing awareness to. So now we'll talk about US Congress. And first, appropriations. And I'll note that understand that appropriations is not a term that people are using in their daily lives. It is very specific to talking about Congress, but it is an important function of Congress. So appropriations is that process of making sure our federal agencies have resources. And when they fail to do that, there's a government shutdown. So what we saw over this past year was a long government shutdown and then tense negotiation. But finally, in January 2026, Congress passed funding for federal wildlife agencies to operate until September 2026. So they passed funding, but noting here that for the Endangered Species Act programs that are implemented under Fish and Wildlife Service, they had about a 6.8% decrease in funding compared to 2024. And there's a lot of ways to slice and dice how you look at the agencies, and some had even more of a decrease. There are some programs that had more than a 10% decrease, some that had a bit less, but just like a quick look of just some of the core ESA programs under Fish and Wildlife Service saw this 6.8% decrease. But thankfully, appropriations did not include new poison pill riders. And I'll note that these appropriations bills tend to be a vulnerable place for having what we call poison pill riders. And because of that high stakes negotiation and the potential of a shutdown, there's a susceptibility for that. Thankfully, we didn't see that. I'll note, what am I saying when I say poison pill riders? These are some examples of ones that were proposed and thankfully did not become law. So just a few examples. The appropriations bill had, at the negotiation stage, it had a provision that would delist the gray wolf nationwide. It had a provision that would delist the Yellowstone area grizzly bear nationwide, had a provision to block critical habitat designation for Rice's whale. This is just a few. There were over a dozen others, but that's just to give you a sense of what was put on the table and what was pushed through, that thankfully with really smart advocacy, that it was stopped from becoming final law. And then a last topic here is the ESA Amendments Act. It's HR 1897. This is a bill that would thoroughly eviscerate the Federal Endangered Species Act, removing key provisions essential to protecting species at risk of extinction. This bill would turn reviews into rubber stamp approvals for polluters, fast track extinction by making it harder to add species to the list, and create carve-outs from critical habitats. This is a comprehensive overhaul of the Endangered Species Act, the most thorough, comprehensive rewrite of the Endangered Species Act that has ever been proposed in the history of the Act. And I'll note, going back to a Professor Pat Parento quote, stopping this bill is the single most important thing you can do to preserve the Endangered Species Act. And ending with a bit of good news, we did see that this bill was scheduled for a vote on April 22nd, 2026. That happened to be Earth Day, and the vote was canceled. So here is one news headline about it. There's several other news sources where you can learn more about that, the ESA Amendments Act being scheduled for a vote and then the vote being canceled because of bipartisan opposition. Also have on Endangered Species Coalition website a blog post about the coalition advocacy efforts that went into stopping this from having a vote. And so I'll note that it didn't get a vote, so technically it still could come back this Congress, and then of course in the future it could come back. But it's really promising, a really encouraging show of bipartisan opposition to this bill, that this vote, was kind of put forth but then canceled. That's a incredibly encouraging show of bipartisan opposition, and that there's, that we mentioned before that 84% of people support the Endangered Species Act, and that's still being reflected in Congress despite these proposals. That support is still being reflected by our representatives, and we're going to stay vigilant and keep up the advocacy to talk about why the Endangered Species Act is working, and call attention to why this proposal is so harmful. But this is, was a really great way for this was a really great moment for our advocacy efforts. And with that, I'll wrap up. Happy Endangered Species Day. And I'll note here that if you're interested in following along more, in endangered.org/take action is a place where we keep updated on the most relevant messages that you could be sending to your member of Congress, or in public comment periods that are open right now. And of course, invite you to follow Endangered Species Coalition on our email list or other social media platforms, and stay in touch with us, because together we are stronger and our wildlife are worth it. Thank you.